Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single posse riding out on an adventure. Thank you for listening to Blood and Dust, a wild western action adventure. Chapter 1. The sun, a molten disk of brass, hung low over the vast parched plains of the Texas Panhandle, baking the earth to a cracked and brittle crust. A haze of fine red dust, churned up by the hooves of 1,000 cattle, hung in the air, a spectral shroud that muted the already harsh landscape. Rip Campbell, his face a canvas of sun-weathered leather and grit, squinted against the glare, his eyes the color of storm-washed slate, scanning the horizon. He sat astride his big sorrel, Diablo, a horse as tough and unyielding as the land itself, the reins held loosely in his calloused hands. Beside him, Stan Sebastian, a man built like an oak, his broad shoulders straining against his faded denim shirt, shifted in his saddle, his gaze mirroring Rip's. Behind them, Ron Carter, lean and wiry, and Cal Jones, his youthful face usually bright, now etched with a weary grimness, herded the tail end of the Z-Brand's herd. The lowing of the cattle, a mournful rhythmic drone, was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence, save for the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of hooves. They were driving the herd to Tascosa, a town notorious for its rough-and-tumble reputation, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye, and where law was often a distant, forgotten concept. The Z-Brand, their brand a simple, stark Z burned into the hides of their cattle, represented their hard-won stake in this unforgiving land. They had struggled, fought, and bled to carve out their piece of the frontier, and this drive was meant to secure their future. Cal, riding a chestnut mare, had peeled off from the herd a few miles back, heading towards a cluster of scrub oak and mesquite. He was to scout ahead, to check for water and any signs of trouble. Rip, his gut tightening with a premonition he couldn't shake, watched him go. Cal was young, too green for this country, but his spirit was strong, and he was eager to prove himself. The sun continued its relentless descent, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. The air grew cooler, but the dust remained, a persistent choking presence. As the light began to fade, a single gunshot shattered the silence, echoing across the desolate landscape. Rip's hand instinctively went to the Colt peacemaker at his hip, his muscles tensing. Stan, his face grim, spurred his horse forward, while Ron, ever vigilant, scanned the surrounding terrain. They found Cal a short distance from the trail, his mare standing nervously beside him, its flanks lathered in sweat. Cal lay sprawled on the ground, his face pale, his shirt stained a dark spreading crimson. Rip slid off Diablo, his boots crunching on the parched earth, and knelt beside Cal. He tore open the young man's shirt, revealing a ragged wound just below his ribs. The bullet had torn through flesh and bone, a brutal, ugly gash. Cal's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes fluttering open and closed. "Hewitt," Cal whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. "He robbed the money." Rip's jaw tightened. Hewitt. The name was a venomous whisper on the wind. A known predator, a snake in the grass, operating out of Tascosa. He'd heard tales of Hewitt's ruthlessness, his penchant for preying on the weak and unwary. Stan, his face a mask of fury, knelt beside Rip. "The money, Rip. All of it." Rip nodded, his gaze fixed on Cal's ashen face. The money from the sale of the cattle, their hard-earned wages, their future was gone. "He came out of nowhere," Cal gasped, his voice fading. "Like a ghost." Rip's blood boiled. This was more than just robbery. It was a violation, a desecration of their work, their sweat, their very lives. He looked at Stan and Ron, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a shared rage. "We'll get him, Cal," Rip said, his voice low and steady, a promise forged in the crucible of the frontier. "We'll get every last cent back." He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was more than just about money. It was about justice, about drawing a line in the dust, about refusing to be prey. He looked at the vast, unforgiving landscape, at the fading light, and he knew that the trail ahead would be long and hard, a trail of vengeance that would lead him into the heart of Tascosa, into the lair of the snake named Hewitt. As they carefully lifted Cal onto his mare, the weight of the wounded man and the weight of the stolen money pressed down on Rip. He looked to the darkening horizon, the stars beginning to prick the vast expanse of the night sky, and he knew that the hunt had begun. The dust, still thick in the air, seemed to whisper a promise of blood, a promise of retribution, a promise that the Z-brand would not be broken. The trails ahead were fraught with peril, but Rip Campbell, a man forged in the fires of the frontier, would not be deterred. He would follow the trail of blood and dust, and he would find Hewitt no matter the cost. Chapter 2. The chill of the desert night settled upon the camp like a shroud, the embers of the fire casting long, dancing shadows that flickered across the faces of the men. Rip Campbell, his jaw set in a grim line, surveyed the meager supplies laid out before him. The air, still thick with the lingering scent of dust and the metallic tang of blood, carried the mournful cries of coyotes echoing across the desolate plains. Cal, resting in a makeshift bedroll, his breathing shallow and labored, remained a constant, stark reminder of the day's brutality. Stan Sebastian, his massive frame a silhouette against the starlit sky, meticulously cleaned his Winchester rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a counterpoint to the rustling wind. Ron Carter, ever the pragmatist, sharpened his bowie knife, the blade glinting in the firelight, a silent promise of retribution. "We ride at first light," Rip declared, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, his gaze fixed on the map spread out before him. Tascosa, a blot of lawlessness upon the vast canvas of the territory, lay marked with a crude circle. "Hewitt won't be expecting us so soon. He'll believe he's safe, that he's vanished like smoke." Stan nodded, his eyes narrowed, a fierce determination etched upon his weathered features. "He won't be safe long. That snake's gonna pay for what he did to Cal." Rip's mind replayed the day's events, the sudden crack of the rifle, Cal's fall, the hollow, empty feeling of their stolen future. He wrestled with the instinct to ride alone, to pursue Hewitt with the single-minded focus of a wolf on the hunt. Yet, something had shifted within him, a recognition of the bond forged in shared hardship, the understanding that they were stronger together than apart. He unfolded a worn leather pouch, revealing a handful of cartridges and a small, tarnished silver dollar. "We'll need every round, every scrap of information we can gather," he stated, his voice tight. "Tascosa is a viper's nest. We'll be walking into the belly of the beast." Ron, his keen eyes scanning the surrounding darkness, spoke in a low, measured tone. "Hewitt won't be alone. He'll have cronies, men as low and vicious as himself. We'll need to move like shadows, strike like lightning." Rip turned his attention to his saddlebags, extracting a worn, leather-bound journal. Within its pages, he had meticulously recorded every detail of their cattle drive, every trail, every waterhole, every potential threat. He flipped through the entries, searching for any clue, any hint that might lead them to Hewitt. "We'll need to know his habits, his haunts, his contacts," Rip mused, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Where he drinks, where he gambles, who he trusts." Stan, his rifle now gleaming, placed it carefully beside his saddle. "Tascosa is a town of whispers. Someone will talk for the right price." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "We'll find those whispers, and we'll make them sing." He turned to a canvas bag, opening it to reveal an assortment of tools, a small medical kit, and a coil of rope. "We'll need to be prepared for anything. This ain't going to be a simple gunfight." He examined the Colt Peacemaker, his fingers tracing the worn steel, a weapon as familiar and reliable as his own hand. He checked the cylinder, ensuring each chamber was loaded, the metallic clicks echoing in the stillness of the night. Ron, his knife now razor-sharp, began to fashion a leather sheath, his movements precise and efficient. "We'll need to move fast, hit hard, and disappear before they know what's happened," he advised, his voice a low growl. Rip rose, his gaze sweeping across the camp, taking in the rugged faces of his partners, the flickering firelight, the vast star-studded sky. "We'll ride into Tascosa with the sun in our eyes, and we won't leave until Hewitt answers for what he did." He felt a surge of resolve, a steely determination that banished any lingering doubts. They were no longer just cattlemen. They were hunters, driven by a thirst for justice, bound by a loyalty forged in the crucible of hardship. They would face the lawless town, the treacherous men, and the lurking danger with a united front, their resolve as unyielding as the granite peaks that rose in the distance. The sun, when it finally broke across the horizon, would illuminate a path of vengeance, a trail of retribution that would lead them directly to Hewitt. Chapter 3. The sun, a merciless eye in the vast cerulean sky, beat down upon the dusty track that led towards Tascosa. Rip Campbell, his face a study in grim determination, guided Diablo through the parched landscape, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of fine red dust that swirled and danced in the stifling heat. Beside him, Stan and Ron rode in silent vigilance, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. Tascosa, a festering wound upon the Texas plains, loomed ahead, a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled together like vultures around a carcass. The town's reputation preceded it, a place where the law held little sway, where gunfights erupted with alarming frequency, and where men settled their disputes with lead and steel. It was a haven for outlaws, gamblers, and drifters, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. Rip, his senses heightened, felt a tightening in his gut as they approached the town. He knew that entering Tascosa was akin to stepping into a den of rattlesnakes, each one poised to strike. They rode past the skeletal remains of abandoned wagons, their wheels half buried in the sand, silent testaments to the harsh realities of frontier life. The main street, a wide, dusty thoroughfare, was a chaotic scene of activity. Cowboys, their faces grim and sun-weathered, swaggered along the boardwalks, their spurs jingling with each step. Gamblers, their eyes darting nervously, huddled around makeshift tables in the shade of ramshackle saloons. Horses tied to hitching posts shifted restlessly, their hooves kicking up plumes of dust. Rip reined in Diablo, his gaze sweeping across the scene, taking in every detail. He noticed the furtive glances, the whispered conversations, the air of menace that hung heavy over the town. Tascosa was a place where suspicion was a way of life, where trust was a rare and precious commodity. "We'll need to move carefully," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the din of the town. Hewitt could be anywhere. Stan, his eyes narrowed, nodded in agreement. "We'll split up, gather information. Keep your eyes peeled, and your hand close to your iron." Ron, ever the silent observer, simply nodded, his gaze fixed on a group of men gathered outside the Red Dog Saloon, their faces etched with a predatory intensity. Rip dismounted, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. He tied Diablo to a hitching post, his gaze lingering on the worn leather of his saddle, a silent reminder of the long journey ahead. He adjusted his hat, pulling it low over his eyes, and stepped onto the boardwalk, the weathered planks creaking beneath his weight. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze scanning the faces of the townsfolk, searching for any sign of Hewitt. He entered a dusty mercantile, the air thick with the smell of leather and tobacco. The proprietor, a gaunt man with a nervous twitch, eyed him suspiciously. "Looking for something, stranger?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Just passing through," Rip replied, his tone casual. "Heard this was a lively town." The proprietor chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Lively is one word for it. Depends on what you're looking for." Rip leaned against the counter, his gaze sweeping across the shelves. "Looking for a man named Hewitt. Heard he frequents this establishment." The proprietor's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "Hewitt? I don't know any Hewitt." Rip's gaze hardened. "Don't play coy with me. I know he's here. I just want to know where to find him." The proprietor hesitated, his eyes darting nervously towards the back of the store. "I can't help you," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You'd be better off leaving town." Rip straightened, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not leaving until I find him." He turned and walked out of the mercantile, the proprietor's gaze following him like a shadow. He knew that the man was lying, that Hewitt was indeed in Tascosa. The fear in his eyes was a testament to the man's power, a power that Rip intended to dismantle. He stepped back onto the boardwalk, his gaze sweeping across the chaotic scene. Tascosa was a town without law, a place where justice was a commodity to be bought and sold. But Rip Campbell, a man forged in the crucible of the frontier, would not be deterred. He would find Hewitt, and he would settle the score no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The raucous din of the Red Dog Saloon spilled out onto the dusty street like a torrent of vice. Inside, the air hung thick with the pungent aroma of stale whiskey, cigar smoke, and unwashed bodies. A cacophony of clinking glasses, boisterous laughter, and the tinny jangle of a worn-out piano filled the room. Rip Campbell, his face a mask of stoic resolve, pushed through the swinging doors, his gaze sweeping across the throng of hardened faces. The saloon, a cavernous space dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, pulsed with a raw, untamed energy. Gamblers, their eyes gleaming with avarice, hunched over green felt tables, their chips clattering like hailstones. Cowboys, their faces flushed with liquor, roared and hollered, their voices echoing off the rough-hewn walls. Women, their faces painted and their dresses gaudy, moved through the crowd, their laughter sharp and brittle. Rip, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt, moved through the throng with a quiet purpose, his gaze searching for any sign of Hewitt. He paused at the bar, the polished wood sticky with spilled liquor, and ordered a whiskey, his eyes never leaving the crowd. The bartender, a burly man with a scarred face and a greasy apron, slid a glass across the counter, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You new in town, stranger?" he growled. "Just passing through," Rip replied, his voice low and steady. "Looking for a man named Hewitt." The bartender's eyes flickered, a flicker of fear crossing his features. "Never heard of him," he muttered, turning away to serve another customer. Rip took a sip of his whiskey, the fiery liquid burning a path down his throat. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on a group of men huddled in a corner, their faces shadowed by their wide-brimmed hats. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around the room. He recognized one of them, a wiry man with a crooked nose from the mercantile. He had seen the fear in the man's eyes when he mentioned Hewitt's name. It was a lead. Rip finished his whiskey and set the glass down on the counter. He moved towards the corner, his boots crunching on the sawdust-covered floor. As he approached, the men fell silent, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of suspicion and hostility. "You boys seem to be having a private conversation," Rip said, his voice cutting through the din of the saloon. "Mind if I join you?" The wiry man with the crooked nose spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "We ain't got nothing to say to you, stranger. You'd best move along." "I'm looking for a man named Hewitt," Rip repeated, his voice unwavering. "I believe you gentlemen might know him." The men exchanged nervous glances. The wiry man spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "We don't know no Hewitt. Now leave us be." Rip leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not leaving until I find him. And I'm not afraid to make a little noise if I have to." He reached into his coat and pulled out the tarnished silver dollar, placing it on the table. The men's eyes widened, their gaze fixed on the coin. "That's just a taste," Rip said, his voice low and menacing. "There's more where that came from, if you cooperate." The men hesitated, their eyes darting between the silver dollar and Rip's unwavering gaze. The wiry man, his eyes gleaming with avarice, spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone. "Hewitt, he's in the back room, playing cards with some of his boys." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "Thank you for your cooperation." He turned and walked towards a door at the back of the saloon, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A group of men, their faces grim, sat around a green felt table, their eyes fixed on a deck of cards. In the center of the table, A pile of money lay scattered, a testament to the high stakes. Hewitt sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold calculation. He looked up as Rip entered, his eyes widening with surprise. "Well, well, well," Hewitt drawled, his voice laced with menace. "Look what the cat dragged in. You must be lost, stranger." Rip stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on Hewitt. "I'm not lost," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here to collect what's mine." He drew his Colt, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. "And you, Hewitt, are going to pay for what you did to Cal Jones." Chapter 5. The report of Rip's Colt shattered the tense stillness of the back room, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingling with the stale odor of whiskey and sweat. Hewitt, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief, lurched back in his chair, a crimson stain blossoming on his chest. The other card players, a motley crew of hard-eyed desperados, scrambled for their weapons, their faces contorted with rage and fear. Rip, his movements swift and practiced, spun on his heel, the Colt bucking in his hand as he fired a second shot. A burly man with a scarred cheek crumpled to the floor, his pistol clattering uselessly against the wooden planks. The room erupted in a chaotic flurry of gunfire, the air thick with lead, and the deafening roar of pistols. He dove behind the overturned card table, the heavy oak offering a meager shield against the hail of bullets. Splinters of wood flew as lead tore through the tabletop, the sound like a swarm of angry wasps. He returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, picking off his adversaries one by one. The room was a swirling vortex of smoke and violence, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood. He knew he couldn't linger. He had to escape. He rolled out from behind the table, his boots pounding on the floor as he charged towards the back door. He kicked it open, bursting into the alleyway behind the saloon. The alley was a narrow, shadowed passage, littered with discarded barrels and refuse. He sprinted down its length, his boots kicking up clouds of dust, the echoes of gunfire ringing in his ears. He vaulted over a stack of crates, landing with a thud on the other side. He emerged onto a side street, his heart pounding, his lungs burning. He glanced back, seeing the silhouettes of his pursuers pouring out of the saloon, their faces grim and determined. He had to reach Diablo. He cut through a maze of narrow streets and back alleys, his movements fluid and silent like a phantom in the night. He could hear the shouts of the townsfolk, the clatter of hooves as men mounted their horses, the rising crescendo of the pursuit. He reached the hitching post where Diablo stood, the sorrel shifting nervously, sensing the tension in the air. He untied the reins, his movements swift and practiced, and swung into the saddle. He spurred Diablo, the horse leaping forward, his hooves pounding on the dusty street. He raced through the town, dodging wagons and pedestrians, his gaze fixed on the open plains beyond. He could hear the pursuing posse gaining on him, their shouts echoing in the night. He urged Diablo on, the horse's powerful muscles straining as he galloped through the darkening streets. He burst out of Tascosa, the open plains stretching before him like a vast dark ocean. He didn't look back. He knew they would be relentless. He rode hard, the wind whipping through his hair, the sound of the pursuit fading into the distance. He rode until Diablo's flanks were lathered in sweat, until the moon hung high in the sky, a silver disk in the inky blackness. He finally reined in, allowing the horse to catch his breath. He dismounted, his legs aching, his body weary. He surveyed the landscape, a vast expanse of rolling hills and scrub brush. He knew he couldn't stay in one place, they would track him. He had to disappear, to vanish like a ghost. He led Diablo into a rocky ravine, the steep walls offering a natural barrier. He found a small cave, hidden behind a thicket of mesquite, and led Diablo inside. He removed the saddle and bridle, allowing the horse to rest. He sat at the mouth of the cave, his gaze fixed on the starlit sky. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. Hewitt's men, and likely the town's corrupt marshal, would be on his trail, driven by vengeance and the promise of reward. He had to think, to plan his next move. He needed to disappear, to become a shadow in the wilderness. He needed to find a way to turn the tables, to become the hunter, not the hunted. He would use the land, the unforgiving expanse of the frontier, as his ally. He would become a phantom, a legend whispered in the saloons and around campfires, a force of vengeance that would not be denied. He would return to Tascosa, but not as a hunted man. He would return as the bringer of justice. Chapter 6. The sun, a blazing orb, had barely crested the horizon when Rip Campbell, his senses honed by nights spent beneath the vast, star-dusted canopy, saddled Diablo. The sorrel, rested and ready, snorted softly, its breath misting in the cool morning air. Rip, his face etched with the weariness of a man hunted, adjusted his worn leather saddlebags, the weight of his colt a familiar comfort against his hip. He had spent the night in a hidden ravine, a natural fortress of rock and scrub, a place where he could observe the surrounding landscape without being seen. He knew the pursuit would be relentless. Hewitt's men, driven by greed and a thirst for vengeance, would scour the countryside, their eyes searching for any sign of his passage. He had to move quickly, to put as much distance between himself and Tascosa as possible. He led Diablo out of the ravine, the horse's hooves finding purchase on the rocky terrain. He rode westward, following the faint trace of an old cattle trail, a ribbon of dust winding its way through the desolate landscape. The air, crisp and clear, carried the scent of sagebrush and dry grass, a stark contrast to the stench of gunpowder and fear that lingered in his memory. He rode for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the heat intensifying with each passing moment. As the sun reached its zenith, casting long, stark shadows across the parched earth, Rip spotted a cluster of cottonwoods in the distance, a promise of shade and water. He urged Diablo forward, the horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the heat haze. He reached the cottonwoods, finding a small spring bubbling from the rocky ground, a welcome oasis in the arid landscape. He dismounted, allowing Diablo to drink his fill, and then settled beneath the shade of a gnarled cottonwood, his gaze scanning the surrounding terrain. He knew he couldn't linger, he had to keep moving. But the weariness gnawed at him, a deep, bone-aching fatigue that threatened to overwhelm him. As he leaned against the rough bark of the cottonwood, his eyes drifting closed, he heard the faint sound of approaching hooves. He snapped awake, his hand instinctively reaching for his colt. He peered through the thick foliage, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a group of riders approaching from the east. They were a motley crew, their faces hidden beneath dusty bandanas, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. Their movements were furtive, their demeanor predatory. Rip's gut tightened. They were not cowboys. They were bandits, outlaws, men who preyed on the weak and unwary. He watched as they approached the spring, their horses lathered in sweat, their riders looking weary and desperate. He knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't allow them to spot him. He slipped behind a thicket of mesquite, his Colt drawn, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. As the bandits approached the spring, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Two of the riders were Stan and Ron. He couldn't believe his eyes. What were they doing with these outlaws? Had they betrayed him? He watched as they dismounted, their movements tense and guarded. He couldn't hear their words, but he could sense the tension in the air. He saw Stan's face, a mask of grim determination, and Ron's, his eyes darting nervously around the landscape. Suddenly, one of the bandits drew his pistol, leveling it at Stan. Rip's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let them harm his partners. He stepped out from behind the mesquite, his Colt barking, the report echoing across the desolate landscape. The bandits spun around, their faces contorted with surprise and fear. Rip fired again, his shots finding their mark, sending two of the outlaws sprawling to the ground. Stan and Ron, their eyes wide with shock, drew their own weapons, joining the fray. The air crackled with gunfire, the acrid scent of gunpowder filling the air. Rip moved with a speed and precision born of years spent on the frontier, his Colt a deadly extension of his will. The bandits, caught off guard, were no match for the combined firepower of Rip, Stan, and Ron. In a matter of minutes, the fight was over. The remaining bandits, their faces pale with fear, scattered and fled, their horses pounding across the parched earth. Rip, Stan, and Ron stood together, their chests heaving, their faces grim. Rip looked at his partners, his eyes searching for any sign of betrayal. "What were you doing with those outlaws?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Stan looked at him, his face a mixture of relief and anger. "We were trying to find you, Rip. They ambushed us on the trail, forced us to lead them here. We knew they were after you." Ron nodded, his voice tight. "We were hoping to turn the tables on them, led them into a trap." Rip's gaze softened. He had misjudged them. They had risked their lives to find him, to protect him. He holstered his Colt, a wave of relief washing over him. They were still partners, bound by a loyalty forged in the fires of the frontier. Chapter 7. The twilight painted the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a stark contrast to the grim reality of their situation. A small campfire crackled merrily, casting flickering shadows that danced across the faces of Rip, Stan, and Ron. Cal, his breathing still shallow, lay wrapped in blankets, his pale face illuminated by the fire's glow. The stench of antiseptic and burnt cloth mingled with the earthy scent of sagebrush and the metallic tang of spent cartridges. The silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft whinny of Diablo, was heavy with unspoken words. The events of the day, the ambush, the revelation of Stan and Ron's forced alliance with the bandits, hung in the air like a shroud. Rip, his face a study in contemplation, stared into the flames, the embers reflecting in his storm-gray eyes. Stan, his massive frame hunched forward, stirred the coals with a gnarled stick, the firelight highlighting the lines of worry etched on his weathered face. "We should have found you sooner, Rip," he rumbled, his voice thick with remorse. "We tracked your sign, but those snakes were faster." Ron, ever the pragmatist, cleaned his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes a counterpoint to Stan's rumbling voice. "They knew the terrain better than we did. And they were expecting you. We were blind." Rip, his gaze still fixed on the flames, finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You came. That's what matters." He paused, his gaze shifting to Cal, his expression softening. "How is he?" Stan glanced at Cal, his brow furrowed. "He's holding on. But that wound, it's bad. We need to get him to a doctor, and fast." Rip nodded, his jaw tightening. "Tascosa is out of the question. We'll head west, towards Fort Griffin. There's a doctor there, a good one." Ron, his rifle gleaming in the firelight, nodded in agreement. "It's a long ride, but it's our best chance." The silence returned, heavier this time, laden with the weight of their shared burden. Rip rose, his movements fluid and silent, and walked to the edge of the camp, his gaze sweeping across the vast starlit expanse. The land, once a source of freedom and opportunity, now seemed to hold a lurking menace, a constant reminder of the dangers that surrounded them. He thought of Cal, his young face etched with pain, his dreams of a life on the frontier shattered by a bullet. He thought of Hewitt, the snake who had slithered into their lives, poisoning their dreams with greed and violence. And he thought of Tascosa, a town steeped in lawlessness, a place where justice was a forgotten concept. He returned to the campfire, his face set in a grim line. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "About what happened back there." Stan and Ron exchanged glances, their expressions somber. They knew what he was referring to, the forced alliance with the bandits, the lingering suspicion that had hung between them. "Those men," Rip continued, his voice low and steady, "they were after me. They knew I was coming. They knew I was after Hewitt." "How?" Ron, his gaze unwavering, spoke first. "They said they had eyes in Tascosa. Someone tipped them off, told them you were coming. They were waiting for you, hoping to catch you alone." Stan nodded, his expression grim. They wanted you alive, Rip. They said Hewitt wanted to talk. Rip's eyes narrowed. Talk? After what he did to Cal? After stealing our money? They didn't say what he wanted to talk about, Ron replied. But they were adamant. They said it was important. Rip stared into the fire, his mind racing. Someone in Tascosa had betrayed him, had tipped off Hewitt's men. But who? And why? He felt a wave of suspicion, a gnawing doubt that threatened to erode the trust he had placed in his partners. He looked at Stan and Ron, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, their expressions open and honest. He saw no deceit, no hidden agendas. He saw only loyalty, a shared determination to see justice done. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, and spoke, his voice firm and resolute. "We're partners," he said, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "We've been through hell together, and we'll get through this. We'll find out who betrayed us, and we'll make them pay. But we'll do it together, as partners." Stan and Ron nodded, their expressions relieved. The unspoken tension that had hung between them dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of unity. They were partners, bound by a loyalty forged in the harsh realities of the frontier, a bond that could not be broken by suspicion or doubt. They were partners in truth, and they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. Chapter 8. The dawn, a pale sliver of light, crept across the desolate plains, casting long skeletal shadows that stretched towards the weary travelers. Rip, his face etched with the lines of sleepless nights, surveyed the rugged terrain, his gaze scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of a hidden stream. They had made camp in a sheltered hollow, a natural fortress of rock and scrub, providing a semblance of security amidst the vast, unforgiving landscape. Cal, his breathing labored, rested in a makeshift bedroll, his feverish brow glistening in the pale morning light. Stan, his massive frame a silhouette against the brightening sky, meticulously checked the horses, ensuring their saddles were secure and their water bags full. Ron, his eyes sharp and alert, patrolled the perimeter, his rifle held at the ready. Rip, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions, turned his attention to the map spread out before him. The route to Fort Griffin, a winding trail through treacherous canyons and across barren plateaus, was marked with a series of crude symbols, each representing a potential danger or a source of sustenance. He traced the path with his calloused finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We'll need to cross the Devil's Backbone," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rustling wind. "It's a narrow pass, but it's the quickest route to the fort." Stan, his voice a low rumble, approached the map. "Devil's Backbone? That's Apache country, Rip. They don't take kindly to trespassers." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "We don't have a choice. We need to get Cal to a doctor, and we need to find out who's behind Hewitt." Ron, returning from his patrol, joined them, his expression grim. "Those bandits weren't just after you, Rip. They were well-equipped, well-informed. They knew your movements, your plans. They were more than just common outlaws." Rip's eyes narrowed. They were working for someone else. Someone powerful. Someone who wants to control this territory. He recalled the words of the bandits, their insistence that Hewitt wanted to talk. It wasn't a simple robbery. It was a calculated move, a power play. He felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of unease that settled deep in his bones. They were up against something bigger than they had imagined, a hidden enemy operating in the shadows. He turned to Stan and Ron, his gaze unwavering. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings. We need to find out who's behind Hewitt." Stan nodded, his expression grim. "We'll need to find someone who knows Tascosa, someone who knows the players. Someone who can tell us what's really going on." Ron, ever the pragmatist, spoke up. "We'll need to be careful. Tascosa is a town of whispers, a place where secrets are bought and sold. We'll need to find the right whisperer, someone we can trust. Rip's mind raced, searching for any connection, any clue that might lead them to the hidden enemy. He thought of the ranchers, the smallholders struggling to survive in the harsh frontier, their livelihoods threatened by rustlers and land grabbers. He thought of the merchants, the businessmen who profited from the chaos, their hands stained with the blood of the innocent. "There's more to this than just stolen money," he declared, his voice tight with resolve. "It's about control. It's about power. Someone wants to control this territory, and they're using Hewitt as a pawn." He looked at his partners, their faces etched with determination. They were no longer just cattlemen. They were investigators, hunters, driven by a thirst for justice. They would unravel the conspiracy, expose the hidden enemy, and bring them to justice. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow across the rugged landscape, they prepared to depart. They packed their supplies, saddled their horses, and loaded Cal onto a makeshift stretcher. They were heading into the unknown, into the heart of danger, but they were united, bound by a loyalty forged in the fires of the frontier. They were partners, and they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The journey to Fort Griffin and the unraveling of the conspiracy had begun. Chapter 9. The wind, a relentless phantom, whipped across the desolate plains, carrying with it the grit of parched earth and the mournful lowing of cattle. The Z-Brand Ranch, a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled against the vast expanse of the Texas sky, stood like a solitary sentinel against the encroaching wilderness. The sun, a brassy disk in the cloudless heavens, beat down upon the land, baking the soil to a cracked and brittle crust. Inside the ranch house, a single room of rough timber construction, the air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of stale coffee. Martha, a woman with hands as calloused as any cowboy's and eyes that held the wisdom of the prairie, moved with a quiet efficiency, tending to the meager supplies laid out on the rough-hewn table. Her brow was furrowed, her gaze troubled, as she surveyed the dwindling stores of flour and beans. Outside, the cattle, their ribs showing through their dusty hides, milled restlessly in the parched corral, their lowing a constant mournful lament. The drought, a merciless scourge, had gripped the land, turning the once lush pastures into a barren wasteland. The water holes, once brimming with life-giving liquid, were now cracked and dry, their beds littered with the sun-bleached bones of perished creatures. Young Tommy, Martha's son, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, struggled to mend a section of the corral fence, his small frame straining against the weight of the weathered timber. The cattle, sensing his weakness, pressed against the fence, their eyes gleaming with a desperate hunger. The boy, his knuckles white, fought to hold the line, his youthful determination a stark contrast to the overwhelming odds. The ranch, once a symbol of hope and prosperity, was now a battleground, a place where survival was a daily struggle. The absence of Rip, Stan, and Ron weighed heavily upon the homestead, a silent testament to the dangers that lurked beyond the ranch's borders. Martha, her heart heavy with worry, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, to keep the ranch running, to keep hope alive. She stepped outside, her gaze sweeping across the parched landscape, searching for any sign of relief. The wind, a constant whispering menace, carried the scent of distant wildfires, a grim reminder of the parched land's vulnerability. The cattle, their eyes pleading, looked to her for guidance, for sustenance. She walked to the edge of the corral, her gaze fixed on the herd, her mind wrestling with the harsh realities of their situation. The lack of water and grazing was taking its toll, weakening the herd, making them susceptible to disease and predators. The financial strain, the mounting debts, threatened to crush them, to erase the hard-won gains of years of toil. She thought of Rip, his unwavering determination, his unwavering belief in the Z-Brand. She knew he wouldn't give up, that he would return, that he would find a way to overcome the challenges that faced them. But the waiting, the uncertainty was a heavy burden to bear. Tommy, his face flushed with exertion, finally secured the fence, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a weary triumph. He looked to his mother, seeking her approval, her encouragement. Martha smiled, her gaze softening. "You did good, Tommy," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Real good." She knew that the ranch's survival depended on their resilience, on their ability to adapt to the harsh realities of the frontier. They had faced adversity before, and they would face it again. They would weather the drought, they would fend off the predators, they would overcome the financial burdens. She turned her gaze to the distant horizon, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. The Z brand would endure. It would survive the drought. It would survive the absence of its founders. It would survive the challenges that lay ahead. The land, though harsh and unforgiving, was their home, their livelihood, their future. And they would fight for it, tooth and nail, until the very end. The sun, as it began to descend, casting long golden shadows across the parched landscape, seemed to whisper a promise of resilience, a promise of survival, a promise that the Z brand would not be broken. Chapter 10. The wind, a constant companion on the desolate plains, whipped at Rip's worn duster as he surveyed the sprawling town of Fort Griffin. The ramshackle collection of saloons, mercantile stores, and dusty corrals buzzed with a frenetic energy, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the open range. Fort Griffin, a hub for cattle drives and a haven for outlaws, held the promise of information, a thread of truth in the tangled web of Hewitt's operation. Rip, Stan, and Ron, their faces weathered and their eyes sharpened by weeks on the trail, moved through the crowded streets with a quiet purpose. Cal, resting in a makeshift room at the town's only doctor's office, was stable, but the urgency to uncover the conspiracy remained. The stolen money, the ambush, the whisper of a hidden enemy, all pointed to a larger, more sinister plot. They entered the dimly lit interior of the Silver Spur Saloon, the air thick with the aroma of stale beer and cheap tobacco. Gamblers hunched over green felt tables, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of oil lamps, while cowboys, their voices boisterous, lined the bar, their spurs jingling with each step. Rip, his gaze scanning the room, spotted a grizzled old prospector nursing a whiskey in a shadowed corner. The man, known as Old Man Finn to the locals, was said to have a network of informants stretching across the territory, a repository of whispered secrets and hidden truths. He approached the old man, his movements quiet and deliberate. "Evening, Finn," he said, his voice low. The prospector, his eyes like chips of flint, looked up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Campbell, ain't it? Heard tell you're stirring up trouble back in Tascosa." Rip slid into the booth opposite him. "Trouble found us, Finn. We're looking for answers." He placed a silver dollar on the table, the coin glinting in the dim light. "We need information about a man named Hewitt, and anyone he's working with." Finn's eyes flickered, his gaze lingering on the coin. "Hewitt's a snake, Campbell. Venomous and slippery. He's got his fingers in a lot of pies. Rustling, gambling, land grabs, he's a busy man." "Who's he working for?" Rip pressed, his voice unwavering. Finn took a swig of his whiskey, his gaze drifting towards the crowded saloon. "That's the question, ain't it? Some say he's got connections in Santa Fe, powerful men with deep pockets. Others say he's just a pawn, a tool for someone closer to home." "Closer to home?" Stan interjected, his voice a low rumble. Finn nodded, his eyes narrowing. "There's a new breed of cattle baron moving in, men who don't play by the old rules. They're buying up land, squeezing out the small ranchers. They're ruthless, Campbell. And they're hungry for power." "Any names?" Ron asked, his voice sharp. Finn hesitated, his gaze darting around the saloon. "There's a man named Silas Thorn. Owns a string of ranches, a lot of influence. He's been seen in Tascosa, whispering in Hewitt's ear." Rip's jaw tightened. Thorn. The name was familiar, a shadowy figure mentioned in hushed tones by struggling ranchers. He was known for his ruthless tactics, his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. "Where can we find him?" Rip asked. Finn shrugged. He's got a spread south of here, Thorn's Rest. But be warned, Campbell. Thorn doesn't take kindly to visitors, especially those asking questions." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "We're not afraid of Thorn." He stood, placing a few more silver dollars on the table. "Thank you, Finn. You've been a great help." They left the saloon, the raucous din fading behind them. The information Finn had provided was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it was just the beginning. They needed to find Thorn, to uncover the truth behind Hewitt's operation. They made their way to the town's telegraph office, a small, dusty room filled with the clatter of the telegraph key. Rip sent a message to Martha, informing her of their progress and assuring her that they were safe. He also requested any information she could gather on Silas Thorn, his business dealings, his associates. As they stepped back onto the dusty street, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. They had a lead, a name, a direction. They were one step closer to uncovering the hidden enemy, to bringing justice to Cal, and to reclaiming their stolen future. The trail ahead was fraught with danger, but they were determined to follow it no matter the cost. They were partners, bound by a loyalty as strong as the iron that forged the frontier, and they would not rest until the truth was revealed. Chapter 11. The vast ochre canvas of the Texas plains stretched before them, an endless expanse of sun-baked earth and thorny scrub. Rip, his face shielded from the relentless glare by the brim of his hat, guided Diablo through the desolate landscape. The horse, a seasoned veteran of long rides and harsh conditions, moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, its hooves kicking up clouds of fine red dust that shimmered in the heat haze. Stan and Ron, their figures silhouetted against the blinding sky, rode flanking Rip, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The air, thick with the scent of sagebrush and parched earth, carried the distant cry of a hawk, a lonely sentinel in the vast emptiness. They were on the trail to Thorn's Rest, a journey that would test their endurance and their resolve. The sun beat down with unrelenting ferocity, baking the earth to a cracked and brittle crust. The heat shimmered off the barren landscape, creating mirages that danced and shifted in the distance, mocking their thirst with illusions of water and shade. The horses, their flanks lathered in sweat, labored under the oppressive heat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They rode through canyons carved by ancient rivers, their walls towering above them like silent sentinels, their shadows offering a brief respite from the scorching sun. They crossed dry riverbeds, their cracked and dusty surfaces a testament to the relentless drought that gripped the land. They navigated treacherous passes, their paths winding through rocky outcrops and thorny thickets, each step a challenge to their horses' sure-footedness. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple, they spotted a cluster of cottonwoods in the distance, a promise of shade and water. They urged their horses forward, their weary limbs finding renewed strength at the prospect of rest. They reached the cottonwoods, finding a small spring bubbling from the rocky ground, a welcome oasis in the arid landscape. They dismounted, allowing their horses to drink their fill, and then set about making camp for the night. The campfire, a small, flickering beacon in the vast darkness, cast dancing shadows that played across their weathered faces. The air, cooled by the approaching night, carried the scent of wood smoke and the faint murmur of the spring. Rip, his gaze fixed on the flames, pondered the information they had gathered in Fort Griffin. Thorn, a man of ruthless ambition and shadowy influence, was their target, their key to unlocking the conspiracy that threatened to engulf them. They were heading into the lion's den, facing a man who held power and influence, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate any threat to his dominion. Stan, his massive frame a silhouette against the starlit sky, stirred the coals with a gnarled stick, sending sparks flying into the darkness. "Thorn won't be expecting us," he rumbled, his voice low. "He'll think we're just another bunch of drifters." Ron, his eyes sharp and alert, scanned the surrounding darkness. "We'll need to move carefully. Thorn's got eyes everywhere. He'll know we're coming." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "We'll approach Thorn's rest under the cover of darkness. We'll observe, gather information. We'll find out what he's hiding." He thought of Cal, his young face etched with pain, his dreams shattered by a bullet. He thought of the stolen money, the hard-earned wages of their labor. He thought of the struggling ranchers, the smallholders fighting to survive against the encroaching tide of ruthless ambition. He knew they were facing a formidable enemy, a man who held power and influence, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. But they were not alone. They were partners, bound by a loyalty forged in the fires of the frontier. They were determined to uncover the truth, to bring justice to Cal, and to protect the land they called home. As the night deepened, the stars shone with a brilliant intensity, their light illuminating the vast, desolate landscape. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of a new day, a day that would bring them closer to their goal. They were on a long ride, a journey fraught with danger, but they would not be deterred. They were partners, and they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. They would see this through, until the very end. Chapter 12. The moon, a silver sickle in the inky blackness, cast long spectral shadows across the rugged terrain. Rip, Stan, and Ron, their figures cloaked in the darkness, moved with the stealth of seasoned hunters. The air, cool and crisp, carried the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of a hidden stream. They were approaching Thorn's Rest, a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley, its buildings silhouetted against the starlit sky. They had left their horses tethered in a secluded ravine, choosing to approach the ranch on foot, their movements silent and deliberate. They moved through the shadows, their eyes scanning the perimeter, searching for any sign of activity. They reached a ridge overlooking the ranch, finding a vantage point hidden among the rocks and scrub brush. Below them, the ranch lay bathed in the pale moonlight. The main house, a two-story structure of stone and timber, stood like a fortress, its windows dark and silent. The bunkhouse, a long, low building, was dimly lit, the sounds of snoring and the occasional murmur of conversation drifting on the night air. The corrals, filled with restless horses and cattle, stretched across the valley floor, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. Rip, his gaze fixed on the main house, felt a sense of unease. There was a stillness about the place, a sense of watchful waiting that made his skin crawl. He knew they were being observed, that eyes were watching their every move. "We'll need to split up," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling wind. "Stan, you circle around to the back of the house. Ron, you cover the bunkhouse. I'll approach the main entrance." They nodded, their movements silent and fluid, as they slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. Rip, his Colt drawn, moved cautiously down the ridge, his boots finding purchase on the rocky terrain. He reached the edge of the ranch yard, finding a patch of shadows beneath a large oak tree. He waited, his senses heightened, his gaze fixed on the main entrance. He heard the faint sound of footsteps, the creak of a door opening, and then the silhouette of a man emerging from the house. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze sweeping across the yard. Rip recognized him. It was Thorn himself, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. He watched as Thorn walked to the edge of the yard, his gaze fixed on the surrounding hills. He seemed to be listening, waiting. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from the shadows. "You're expecting someone, Thorn?" Thorn spun around, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man with a lean, wiry frame and eyes that gleamed like chips of obsidian. Rip recognized him. It was Finn, the old prospector from Fort Griffin. "Just an old friend, Thorn," Finn said, his voice laced with a hint of menace. "I heard you were expecting visitors." Thorn's eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Finn?" "Information," Finn replied, his gaze unwavering. "Information about your dealings with Hewitt." Thorn chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Hewitt?" I don't know any Hewitt. Don't play coy with me, Thorn, Finn said, his voice hardening. I know you're working with him. I know you're behind the rustling, the land grabs, the stolen money. Thorn's face darkened. You're making accusations, Finn. Accusations you can't prove. I have proof, Finn said, his voice low and steady. And I'm not afraid to use it. Rip, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him, felt a surge of hope. Finn was an unexpected ally, a man who possessed the knowledge they needed. What do you want, Finn? Thorn asked, his voice laced with a hint of desperation. I want you to stop, Finn said, his voice firm. I want you to leave this land. I want you to leave these people alone. Thorn hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the surrounding hills. He knew he was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. He knew he was facing an enemy he couldn't defeat. All right, Finn, he said, his voice resigned. You win. I'll leave. But I'm warning you, this isn't over. He turned and walked back towards the house, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. Finn watched him go, his gaze unwavering. Rip, his heart pounding, stepped out from the shadows. Finn turned, his eyes widening with surprise. Campbell, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? We're here for the same reason you are, Finn, Rip replied, his voice low. To stop Thorn. Finn nodded, his gaze softening. I knew you were different, Campbell. I knew you were a man of honor. They were joined by Stan and Ron, their faces etched with surprise and relief. They had found an unexpected ally, a man who shared their goals, a man who possessed the knowledge they needed. They were one step closer to uncovering the truth, to bringing justice to Cal, and to reclaiming their stolen future. The alliance with Finn was unexpected, but it strengthened their resolve. They would face Thorn, and whatever remained of his operation, together. Chapter 13. The sun, a fiery orb, climbed the eastern horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the desolate plains. Rip, Stan, Ron, and Finn, their faces etched with grim determination, guided their horses along the dusty trail that led towards Tascosa. The wind, a constant whisper across the arid landscape, carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant murmur of the Pecos River. They rode in silence, their thoughts heavy with the weight of the task that lay ahead. Tascosa, a town steeped in lawlessness and corruption, awaited them, a viper's nest where Hewitt and his cronies lurked. They had left Thorn's Rest, their unexpected alliance with Finn proving invaluable. The old prospector's knowledge of the territory, his network of informants, and his unwavering commitment to justice had provided them with crucial insights into Hewitt's operation and Thorn's involvement. They had learned that Hewitt was more than just a petty thief. He was a key player in a larger scheme, a puppet manipulated by powerful forces. Thorn, his ambition unchecked, sought to control the region's cattle trade, using Hewitt to eliminate his rivals and consolidate his power. The stolen money, the ambush on Cal, the relentless pursuit, all were part of Thorn's calculated plan. As they approached Tascosa, the town's ramshackle buildings emerged from the heat haze, a stark reminder of the lawlessness that permeated its streets. The air grew thick with the stench of stale whiskey and the metallic tang of gunpowder, a testament to the town's violent reputation. They reined in their horses on a ridge overlooking the town, their gaze sweeping across the chaotic scene below. Cowboys, their faces grim and sun-weathered, swaggered along the boardwalks, their spurs jingling with each step. Gamblers, their eyes gleaming with avarice, huddled around green felt tables in the dimly lit saloons. Horses tied to hitching posts shifted restlessly, their hooves kicking up plumes of dust. Rip, his gaze hardening, surveyed the town, his mind formulating a plan. They couldn't storm into Tascosa, guns blazing. They needed to gather information, to enlist allies, to set the stage for a final confrontation. We'll split up, he declared, his voice low and steady. Finn, you know the town better than any of us. You'll gather information, find out Hewitt's movements, his contacts, his weaknesses. Finn nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. I know a few folks who owe me favors. I'll find out what I can. Stan Ron, Rip continued. You'll scout the saloons, the gambling dens, the places where Hewitt and his men are likely to be found. Keep your eyes open, your ears sharp. We need to know who's on Hewitt's side, who's willing to betray him. Stan and Ron nodded, their expressions grim. They knew the dangers that lurked in Tascosa, the treachery and violence that permeated its streets. I'll head to the mercantile, the sheriff's office, Rip said. I need to gauge the town's mood, to see if there's any support for our cause. They descended the ridge, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust as they entered the town. They moved with a quiet purpose, their movements deliberate, their eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. Rip entered the mercantile, the air thick with the scent of leather and tobacco. The proprietor, a gaunt man with a nervous twitch, eyed him suspiciously. Looking for something, stranger? He asked, his voice raspy. Just passing through, Rip replied, his tone casual. Heard there's been some trouble in town. The proprietor's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. Trouble? What trouble? Rustling robberies, Rip said, his voice low. Heard a man named Hewitt is involved. The proprietor's eyes darted nervously towards the back of the store. I don't know any Hewitt, he stammered, his voice trembling. You'd be better off leaving town. Rip's gaze hardened. He knew the man was lying, that Hewitt's influence permeated every corner of Tascosa. He turned and walked out of the mercantile, his mind churning with the information he had gathered. He made his way to the sheriff's office, a small, dusty building at the end of the street. The sheriff, a burly man with a weathered face and a cynical gaze, sat behind a cluttered desk, his boots propped up on the edge. What can I do for you, stranger? He asked, his voice gruff. I'm looking for a man named Hewitt, Rip said. Heard he's been causing trouble. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Hewitt? He's a respected businessman in this town. Rip chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Respectable? He stole from my partner, shot him down in cold blood. The sheriff's gaze hardened. That's a serious accusation, stranger. You got any proof? I'm gathering it, Rip replied, his voice unwavering. And when I have it, I'll be back. He turned and walked out of the sheriff's office, the sheriff's gaze following him like a shadow. He knew that the sheriff was corrupt, that he was in Hewitt's pocket. But he also knew that there were others in Tascosa, honest men and women, who were tired of the lawlessness, tired of living in fear. He would find them, enlist their support, and bring justice to Tascosa. The return was fraught with danger, yet the resolve of Rip and his partners remained unshaken. Chapter 14. The moon, a pale orb, hung high in the inky expanse, casting a spectral glow across the rooftops of Tascosa. The town, usually a cacophony of drunken brawls and clattering poker chips, lay eerily silent, a hushed anticipation hanging in the air. Rip, his face a mask of grim resolve, surveyed the darkened streets from a rooftop overlooking the Red Dog Saloon. He had spent the day gathering information, enlisting the support of a few disgruntled townsfolk, and laying the groundwork for a trap. Finn, his knowledge of the town's underbelly proving invaluable, had identified Hewitt's usual haunts, his preferred gambling dens, his favorite watering holes. Stan and Ron, their eyes sharp and their movements silent, had scouted these locations, confirming Hewitt's presence and identifying his cronies. The plan was simple, yet fraught with peril. They would lure Hewitt into a trap, expose his crimes, and bring him to justice. They had spread word through the town's grapevine, a whisper of a high-stakes poker game, a game Hewitt couldn't resist. The bait was set, the trap was laid. Below, in the dimly lit alleyway behind the Red Dog Saloon, a small group of men huddled in the shadows, their faces etched with nervous anticipation. These were the townsfolk, the merchants, the ranchers, who had been wronged by Hewitt, who were tired of living in fear. They were Rip's allies, his impromptu posse, willing to risk their lives to reclaim their town. Rip adjusted the rifle, resting on the edge of the rooftop, its cold steel a reassuring presence. He scanned the darkened streets, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of a wooden sign swinging in the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, the nervous shuffle of his allies below. He had positioned his men strategically, placing them in key locations to cut off Hewitt's escape routes. Stan and Ron, their figures barely visible in the shadows, were stationed at either end of the alleyway, their rifles trained on the back door of the saloon. Finn, his knowledge of the town's hidden passages, was positioned in a nearby building, ready to provide backup if needed. The tension mounted, the silence growing heavier with each passing moment. Rip's gaze remained fixed on the back door of the saloon, waiting for Hewitt to take the bait. He knew that Hewitt was a cunning adversary, a man who wouldn't walk into a trap without suspicion. Suddenly, the back door of the saloon creaked open, spilling a sliver of light into the alleyway. Hewitt emerged, his face illuminated by the faint glow of a lantern hanging inside the saloon. He was followed by two burly men, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. Hewitt paused, his gaze sweeping across the alleyway, his eyes searching for any sign of danger. He seemed to sense the trap, his instincts warning him of the impending confrontation. "Something ain't right," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "I don't like this." One of his men, a hulking brute with a scarred face, chuckled. "Relax, Hewitt. It's just a poker game. We'll be in and out before anyone knows we're here." Hewitt hesitated, his gaze still scanning the alleyway. "I got a bad feeling about this," he repeated, his voice laced with unease. He took a step forward, then stopped, his eyes narrowing. He spotted a glint of metal in the shadows, the barrel of a rifle trained on him. "Ambush!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the alleyway. He spun around, drawing his pistol, but it was too late. The alleyway erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Stan and Ron, their rifles barking, picked off Hewitt's men, sending them sprawling to the ground. Hewitt, his eyes wide with fear, scrambled for cover, diving behind a stack of barrels. Rip, his rifle steady, aimed at Hewitt's exposed shoulder and fired. The bullet struck its mark, sending Hewitt stumbling back, his pistol clattering to the ground. The alleyway fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading into the night. Hewitt lay sprawled on the ground, his face contorted with pain and fear. Rip descended from the rooftop, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached Hewitt. He stood over the fallen man, his gaze unwavering. "It's over, Hewitt," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your time is up." Hewitt looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and resignation. "You can't win, Campbell," he gasped, his voice weak. "Thorn won't let you." "Thorn is finished," Rip replied, his voice hardening. "His reign of terror is over." He turned to his allies, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight. "Take him to the sheriff," he said. "Let justice be served." The townsfolk, their faces filled with a sense of relief and triumph, moved forward, their hands reaching for Hewitt. They had reclaimed their town. They had brought justice to Tascosa. The trap had been sprung, and the snake had been caught. The night, though fraught with danger, had brought a sense of closure, a sense of hope to the weary town. Chapter 15. The dawn, a pale blush against the eastern horizon, painted the dusty streets of Tascosa in hues of gray and rose. The aftermath of the previous night's confrontation hung heavy in the air, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingling with the lingering aroma of spilled whiskey and fear. Rip, his face etched with the weariness of a long night, stood beside the sheriff's office, watching as Hewitt, his hands bound, was led into the jail cell. The townsfolk, their faces a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction, had dispersed, returning to their homes and businesses, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that justice had finally been served. The reign of Hewitt, and by extension, Thorn, had come to an abrupt and violent end. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the tension of unresolved matters. The sheriff, his face a mask of grudging respect, sat behind his desk, his gaze fixed on Rip. Stan and Ron, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun, stood beside Rip, their presence a silent testament to the bond of partnership. "You've caused quite a stir, Campbell," the sheriff rumbled, his voice laced with a hint of admiration. "Taking down Hewitt, exposing Thorn, that ain't something a lot of men could do." "It wasn't just me," Rip replied, his voice low and steady. "It was the people of Tascosa. They're tired of living in fear. They're ready for a change." The sheriff nodded, his gaze softening. "You're right about that. This town's been living under a dark cloud for too long. Maybe, just maybe, things are about to change." Rip turned his attention to the jail cell, where Hewitt sat slumped on a wooden bench, his face a mask of defeat. "He's still got connections," Rip said, his voice hardening. "Thorn's men won't let him rot in a jail cell." "We'll transfer him to Fort Stockton," the sheriff replied. "They've got a stronger lockup there. He'll be safe." A sudden commotion erupted outside, the sound of shouting voices and the thunder of hooves echoing through the street. Rip, his hand instinctively reaching for his Colt, stepped out of the sheriff's office, his gaze scanning the scene. A group of riders, their faces hidden beneath dusty bandanas, charged down the street, their pistols blazing. They were Thorn's men, a desperate attempt to free their captured leader. The townsfolk, armed with rifles and shotguns, emerged from their homes and businesses, forming a makeshift barricade. The air crackled with gunfire, the acrid scent of gunpowder filling the street. Rip, Stan, and Ron joined the fray, their rifles barking, their shots finding their mark. The riders, caught off guard by the town's resistance, faltered, their charge breaking into a chaotic retreat. Thorn's men, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned, turned their horses and fled, disappearing into the maze of back alleys and side streets. The townsfolk, their faces flushed with adrenaline, cheered, their voices echoing through the town. Rip, his gaze scanning the retreating riders, felt a sense of unease. He knew this wasn't the end. Thorn was a desperate man, a man who wouldn't give up easily. He turned to the sheriff, his expression grim. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low. "We need to be ready." The sheriff nodded, his face hardening. "We'll fortify the town, set up patrols. We won't let them take Hewitt." The day passed in a tense anticipation, the townspeople preparing for the inevitable return of Thorn's men. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, the riders returned, their numbers bolstered, their faces contorted with rage. The battle raged through the night, the air thick with gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Rip, Stan, and Ron fought alongside the townsfolk, their rifles spitting lead, their determination unwavering. As the final shots echoed into the stillness of the night, Thorn's men, their ranks decimated, retreated, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The townspeople, their faces weary but triumphant, emerged from their barricades, their voices filled with a sense of victory. Rip, his face streaked with sweat and grime, stood beside the sheriff, surveying the aftermath of the battle. He felt a sense of closure, a sense of redemption. He had brought justice to Tascosa, he had avenged Cal, he had exposed Thorn's corruption. "It's over," he said, his voice low and steady. "Thorn's reign of terror is over." The sheriff nodded, his gaze softening. "You've done a good thing, Campbell. You've given this town a chance to start over." Rip looked at the townsfolk, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight. He saw a sense of hope, a sense of unity, a sense of renewal. He knew that Tascosa had changed, that the town had found its voice, its strength. He turned to Stan and Ron, their faces etched with weariness, their eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. They had faced danger, they had faced betrayal, they had faced death. And they had emerged victorious. They were partners, bound by a loyalty forged in the crucible of the frontier. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of justice. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, Rip felt a sense of peace, a sense of completion. He had traveled a long and dangerous road, a road filled with gunfire and redemption. And he had found his way home. Chapter 16. The morning sun, a gentle warmth after the chill of the night, bathed the town of Tascosa in a golden glow. The echoes of the previous night's battle had faded, replaced by the sounds of rebuilding and quiet reflection. Rip, his face bearing the marks of a hard-won victory, stood beside Cal's bedside in the makeshift infirmary, his gaze fixed on the young man's slowly recovering form. Cal's color had returned, his breathing steady, the fever that had gripped him finally broken. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering, and then opened his eyes, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Rip," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Easy, Cal," Rip said, his voice soft. "You're safe now." Cal's gaze shifted, taking in the room, the rough-hewn walls, the simple furnishings. "What happened?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "We settled things," Rip replied, his voice firm. "Hewitt's in jail, Thorn's men are gone. You can rest easy now." A faint smile touched Cal's lips. "You did it," he murmured, his voice filled with admiration. "You got them." Rip nodded, his gaze softening. "We did it, Cal. Together." He stepped out of the infirmary, leaving Cal to rest, and made his way to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, his face etched with a weary satisfaction, sat behind his desk, sorting through paperwork. "Hewitt's been transferred to Fort Stockton," the sheriff announced, his voice gruff. "He'll stand trial there." "Good," Rip said, his voice firm. "He won't be causing any more trouble." "Thorn's men scattered," the sheriff continued. "They won't be back. Not anytime soon, anyway." "They'll be back," Rip countered, his gaze hardening. "Thorn won't give up that easily." "We'll be ready for them," the sheriff replied, his voice resolute. "This town's learned its lesson. We won't be caught off guard again." Rip nodded, his gaze sweeping across the town square. The townsfolk, their faces filled with a newfound sense of purpose, were busy repairing the damage from the battle, rebuilding their homes and businesses. A sense of unity, a sense of community, had taken root in Tascosa. He thought of the trials they had faced, the betrayals, the violence, the loss. He thought of the bonds they had forged, the partnerships that had been tested and strengthened. He thought of the lessons they had learned, the values they had reaffirmed. He walked to the edge of town, his gaze fixed on the vast open plains that stretched towards the horizon. The land, once a source of conflict and greed, now seemed to offer a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. Stan and Ron joined him, their faces etched with a quiet satisfaction. They stood in silence, their gaze fixed on the horizon, their thoughts mirroring Rip's. "What now, Rip?" Stan asked, his voice low. "We head back to the ranch," Rip replied, his voice firm. "There's still work to be done." "What about Thorn?" Ron asked, his brow furrowed. "He won't just disappear." "We'll deal with him," Rip said, his voice hardening. "But first, we need to take care of our own. The ranch needs us." They mounted their horses, their movements fluid and practiced, and turned their backs on Tascosa. They rode in silence, their thoughts heavy with the weight of the past, their hearts filled with the hope of the future. As they rode, Rip reflected on the journey they had undertaken, the trials they had overcome. They had faced danger, they had faced betrayal, they had faced death. And they had emerged victorious. They had found justice, they had found redemption, they had found themselves. He thought of the lessons he had learned, the importance of partnership, the value of loyalty, the strength of community. He thought of the sacrifices that had been made, the lives that had been lost, the dreams that had been shattered. He knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, that new threats would emerge, that new battles would be fought. But he also knew that they were ready, that they were stronger, that they were united. They were partners, bound by a loyalty as strong as the iron that forged the frontier. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of justice. They were survivors, bound by a shared determination to build a better future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, they reached the crest of a hill overlooking the Z-Brand ranch. The ranch, a collection of rough-hewn buildings nestled in a valley, stood like a beacon of hope, a symbol of their resilience, their determination, their dreams. They descended the hill, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust, their hearts filled with a sense of homecoming. They had settled the scores, they had found redemption, they had found their way home. The trails ahead would be long, yet the promise of the Z-Brand and the bonds between them made the journey worth taking. Chapter 17. The morning sun, a radiant orb, painted the rolling hills surrounding the Z-Brand ranch in hues of gold and amber. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming wildflowers, swept across the valley, a stark contrast to the dust-choked air of Tascosa. The ranch, once a symbol of struggle and uncertainty, now pulsed with a renewed sense of vitality, a testament to the resilience of its inhabitants. Rip, Stan, and Ron, their faces bearing the marks of their arduous journey, surveyed the bustling activity with a quiet satisfaction. The cattle, their hides gleaming in the sunlight, grazed peacefully in the lush pastures, their lowing a soothing melody in the tranquil morning air. The corrals, once dilapidated and empty, now teemed with horses, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust as they were saddled and readied for the day's work. Martha, her face etched with a quiet joy, moved with a newfound energy, overseeing the ranch hands as they repaired fences, mended saddles, and tended to the livestock. Young Tommy, his eyes sparkling with excitement, rode alongside the cowboys, his youthful enthusiasm a contagious force. The ranch house, once a place of worry and apprehension, now echoed with laughter and the clatter of cooking utensils. The scent of freshly baked bread and simmering stew wafted through the open windows, a promise of warmth and sustenance. Rip watched the scene unfold, a sense of peace settling over him. He had returned home, not to a place of defeat, but to a place of renewal, a place where the seeds of hope had taken root and blossomed. Stan, his massive frame relaxed, leaned against the corral fence, his gaze fixed on the cattle. "Looks like they did all right without us," he rumbled, his voice laced with a hint of pride. "They did more than all right," Ron replied, his eyes scanning the bustling activity. "They thrived." Rip nodded, his gaze softening. "Martha's a strong woman. She kept the ranch running, kept the spirit alive." He turned his attention to the fields, where the crops were growing tall and healthy, a testament to the recent rains. "The drought's broken," he said, his voice filled with relief. "The land's healing." They walked towards the ranch house, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Martha greeted them with a warm smile, her eyes filled with a quiet joy. "Welcome home," she said, her voice soft. "We've been waiting for you." They entered the ranch house, the air filled with the comforting aroma of home cooking. Cal, his face flushed with health, sat at the table, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're looking good, Cal," Rip said, his voice warm. "I'm feeling good," Cal replied, his voice strong. "I'm ready to get back to work." They sat down at the table, sharing stories of their journey, of the battles fought and the victories won. They spoke of Hewitt's capture, of Thorn's defeat, of the newfound unity in Tascosa. As they ate, Rip outlined his plans for the future of the Z-Brand. He spoke of expanding the herd, of improving the ranch's infrastructure, of building a community that would thrive for generations to come. "We'll need to diversify," he said, his voice firm. "We can't rely solely on cattle. We'll need to grow crops, raise hogs, maybe even start a small trading post. We'll need to build a school," Martha added, her eyes gleaming. "We need to educate our children, give them the tools they need to succeed." "And a church," Cal chimed in, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "We need a place to gather, to celebrate, to find solace." Rip nodded, his heart swelling with pride. They were building more than just a ranch. They were building a community, a legacy. The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity, the ranch hands working with renewed vigor, their spirits lifted by the return of their leaders. Rip, Stan, and Ron joined them, their hands calloused and their movements practiced, their presence a source of inspiration. As the sun began to set, Casting long shadows across the valley, the ranch hands gathered around a large bonfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They shared stories, sang songs, and celebrated their newfound sense of community. Rip stood beside Martha, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. He had returned home, not to a place of defeat, but to a place of renewal, a place where the seeds of hope had taken root and blossomed. He knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, that new threats would emerge, that new battles would be fought. But he also knew that they were ready, that they were stronger, that they were united. They were partners, bound by a loyalty as strong as the iron that forged the frontier. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of justice. They were survivors, bound by a shared determination to build a better future. The Z brand, reborn and revitalized, stood as a testament to their resilience, their courage, their dreams. The ranch, and the community it fostered, would endure. Chapter 18. The sun, a blazing eye in the vast cerulean sky, beat down upon the dusty streets of Fort Stockton. The town, a hub of commerce and law enforcement, buzzed with a newfound energy, a stark contrast to the lawless chaos that had once plagued Tascosa. Rip, his face weathered and his eyes sharp, stood outside the courthouse, his gaze fixed on the imposing structure. He had journeyed to Fort Stockton to witness the trial of Hewitt, to ensure that justice was served. Inside the courtroom, the air hung thick with anticipation. The gallery was packed with townsfolk from Tascosa, ranchers from surrounding territories, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the culmination of the events that had shaken the frontier. Hewitt, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow, sat at the defendant's table, his gaze darting nervously around the room. The trial had been swift and decisive. The prosecution, armed with irrefutable evidence gathered by Rip and his allies, had painted a damning portrait of Hewitt's crimes. The testimony of witnesses, both from Tascosa and beyond, had exposed the extent of his corruption, his involvement in rustling, robbery, and murder. The jury, a panel of hardened frontiersmen, had deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge, a stern and unyielding man, had sentenced Hewitt to hang, his words echoing through the silent courtroom. Rip watched as Hewitt was led from the courtroom, his face a mask of despair. The sentence was harsh, but it was just. Hewitt had sown the seeds of violence and corruption, and now he would reap the bitter harvest. He stepped outside the courthouse, the midday sun beating down upon him. The town square, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now pulsed with a sense of relief and renewal. The townsfolk, their faces filled with a quiet satisfaction, gathered in small groups, discussing the trial, the verdict, the future of their communities. He spotted the sheriff of Tascosa, his face etched with a weary satisfaction, leaning against a hitching post. They had formed an unlikely alliance, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. "Justice has been served," the sheriff said, his voice gruff. "Hewitt got what he deserved." "It's more than just Hewitt," Rip replied, his gaze sweeping across the town square. "It's about sending a message. That lawlessness won't be tolerated. That the frontier isn't a place where men can operate outside the law." The sheriff nodded, his gaze softening. "You've changed things, Campbell. You've shown people that they don't have to live in fear, that they can stand up for themselves." Rip turned his attention to the vast, open plains that stretched beyond the town. "There's still work to be done," he said, his voice hardening. "Thorn's still out there. And there are others like him, men who prey on the weak, who exploit the vulnerable. We'll be ready for them," the sheriff replied, his voice resolute. "We've learned our lesson. We won't be caught off guard again." Rip mounted his horse, his movements fluid and practiced. He looked back at the town, at the courthouse, at the faces of the townsfolk. He had come to Fort Stockton to witness justice, to ensure that the scores were settled. He had done his part. He turned his horse towards the open plains, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The journey ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready. He had faced danger, he had faced betrayal, he had faced death. And he had emerged victorious. He thought of the lessons he had learned, the importance of community, the value of justice, the strength of partnership. He thought of the sacrifices that had been made, the lives that had been lost, the dreams that had been shattered. He knew that the frontier was a place of constant change, a place where new challenges would emerge, new battles would be fought. But he also knew that the spirit of the frontier, the spirit of resilience, the spirit of justice would endure. He rode into the vast expanse, the sun beating down upon him, the wind whispering through the tall grass. He was a frontiersman, a man of the West, a guardian of justice. He would continue to fight for what was right, to protect the innocent, to uphold the law. As he rode, he reflected on the concept of frontier justice. It wasn't always about hangings and gunfights. It was about standing up for what was right, about protecting the vulnerable, about building a community where everyone had a chance to thrive. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, a legacy of hope. The trials of the frontier had forged a man of purpose, a man of action, a man of justice. And that justice would continue to echo across the plains. Chapter 19. The vast expanse of the Z-brand, a tapestry of rolling hills and verdant pastures, stretched before Rip like an open book. The sun, a benevolent eye in the azure sky, cast long shadows as he surveyed the land, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. The ranch, now a thriving hub of activity, hummed with the rhythm of honest labor, a testament to the hard-won peace and prosperity they had achieved. Yet a shadow lingered, a subtle unease that gnawed at the edges of his contentment. He had learned that peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, a fleeting moment in a constant cycle of challenge and change. The defeat of Hewitt and Thorn had cleared the immediate threat, but whispers on the wind spoke of new dangers, of unseen forces stirring in the shadows. He rode toward the southern boundary of the ranch, the land bordering the vast, untamed wilderness. The cattle, their hides gleaming in the sunlight, grazed peacefully, their lowing a soothing counterpoint to the rustling wind. But Rip's gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, where a plume of dust rose against the clear sky. He spurred Diablo forward, the horse's hooves pounding on the sun-baked earth. As he drew closer, he saw a group of riders, their silhouettes stark against the horizon. They were not cowboys, nor were they ranchers. Their movements were too deliberate, their posture too rigid. He reined in Diablo, his hand instinctively resting on the colt at his hip. The riders approached, their faces hidden beneath dusty bandanas, their eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. They were a motley crew, a mix of hardened outlaws and desperate men, their weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight. "You're trespassing," Rip said, his voice low and steady. "This is Z-brand land." The leader of the group, a man with a scarred face and eyes like chips of flint, chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We ain't interested in your land, Campbell," he sneered. "We're looking for something else." "What are you looking for?" Rip asked, his gaze unwavering. "We're looking for a man," the leader replied, his voice laced with menace. "A man who owes us money." Rip's gut tightened. He knew they weren't just looking for a man, they were looking for trouble. He had heard rumors of a new gang operating in the region, a group of ruthless outlaws who preyed on isolated ranches and settlements. "You won't find him here," Rip said, his voice firm. "Now get off my land." The leader's eyes narrowed, his gaze hardening. "We'll find him, Campbell. And when we do, you'll wish you'd stayed out of our way." They turned their horses and rode away, their figures disappearing into the vast expanse of the wilderness. Rip watched them go, his mind churning with the implications of their visit. He knew they would be back, and they would bring trouble with them. He rode back to the ranch house, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the new threat. He found Stan and Ron working in the corral, their faces etched with a quiet determination. He recounted his encounter with the outlaws, their faces darkening with concern. "They're looking for trouble," Stan rumbled, his voice low. "We need to be ready." "They're not the only ones," Ron added, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I've heard whispers of land speculators, men who are trying to buy up land on the cheap." Rip nodded, his gaze hardening. "They're trying to squeeze out the small ranchers, to consolidate their power." He thought of the Z brand, of the community they had built, of the dreams they had shared. He knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. They had to be vigilant, to protect what they had built. "We'll need to strengthen our defenses," he said, his voice firm. "We'll need to patrol the boundaries, to keep a close eye on our neighbors." He turned his attention to the fields, where the crops were growing tall and healthy. "And we'll need to diversify," he continued. "We can't rely solely on cattle. We need to find new sources of income, to make ourselves less vulnerable." He thought of the trading post they had discussed, the idea of establishing a direct line of commerce with the settlements to the south. It was a risky venture, but it could provide a vital lifeline, a buffer against the economic pressures that threatened them. "We'll need to send a scout," he said, his voice resolute. "Someone who can assess the market, find potential partners." He looked at Stan and Ron, their faces etched with a quiet determination. "We'll need to be prepared for anything," he said. "The frontier is a place of constant change. We need to adapt, to evolve, to survive." He knew that the challenges ahead would be formidable, that new threats would emerge from the shadows. But he also knew that they were ready, that they were stronger, that they were united. They were partners, bound by a loyalty as strong as the iron that forged the frontier. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of justice. They were survivors, bound by a shared determination to build a better future. The Z brand, their home, their legacy would endure. Chapter 20. The setting sun, a molten coin sinking below the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, cast long purple shadows across the sprawling expanse of the Z brand. A cool breeze, scented with sagebrush and the faint aroma of wood smoke, whispered across the valley, carrying the lowing of cattle and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Rip Campbell, his face a canvas of sun-weathered leather, stood atop a rocky knoll, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. The Z brand, now a thriving testament to hard work and resilience, pulsed with the rhythm of frontier life. The cattle, sleek and healthy, grazed in the lush pastures. The fields, a patchwork of golden wheat and verdant corn, stretched towards the horizon. The ranch hands, their faces etched with pride, moved with a quiet efficiency, their movements honed by years of toil. He thought of the trials they had faced, the battles fought, the losses endured. He remembered the lawless chaos of Tascosa, the treachery of Hewitt, the ruthless ambition of Thorn. He recalled the bonds forged in the crucible of hardship, the unwavering loyalty of Stan and Ron, the quiet strength of Martha, the burgeoning spirit of Cal. The journey had been long and arduous, a relentless dance with danger and uncertainty. But they had prevailed, their spirit unyielding, their resolve unwavering. They had carved a place for themselves in the unforgiving wilderness, a sanctuary of hope and prosperity. He turned his gaze to the distant horizon, where the trails stretched towards the vast, untamed territories. The frontier, a land of endless possibilities and lurking perils, beckoned with its siren call. He knew that new challenges awaited, that new threats would emerge from the shadows. But he also knew that they were ready, that they were stronger, that they were united. He descended the knoll, his boots crunching on the rocky terrain. He joined Stan and Ron at the corral, where they were saddling their horses, their movements fluid and practiced. "We're heading south," Rip announced, his voice low and steady. "To scout the trading posts, to find potential partners." Stan nodded, his gaze hardening. "We'll need to be cautious. There's still trouble brewing out there." "We'll be ready," Ron added, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We faced worse." They mounted their horses, their movements swift and practiced, and rode out of the corral, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. They followed the winding trail that led towards the southern territories, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the twilight. As they rode, Rip reflected on the lessons he had learned, the values he had reaffirmed. He understood that the frontier was a place of constant change, a place where the strong survived and the weak perished. It was a land of opportunity and danger, of hope and despair. He knew that the trails ahead would be long and challenging, that new adversaries would rise, that new battles would be fought. But he also knew that they were prepared, that they were capable, that they were bound by a loyalty as unyielding as the granite peaks that rose in the distance. They rode through canyons carved by ancient rivers, their walls towering above them like silent sentinels. They crossed barren plateaus, their surfaces cracked and dry, a testament to the harsh realities of the land. They navigated treacherous passes, their paths winding through rocky outcrops and thorny thickets. As the moon, a silver disk in the inky blackness, illuminated their path, they reached a secluded campsite, a hidden oasis nestled among the rocks. They dismounted, allowing their horses to rest, and set about making camp for the night. The campfire, a small, flickering beacon in the vast darkness, cast dancing shadows that played across their weathered faces. The air, cool and crisp, carried the scent of wood smoke and the faint murmur of a nearby stream. Rip sat beside the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames, his mind churning with the possibilities that lay ahead. He thought of the Z brand, of the community they had built, of the legacy they would leave behind. He thought of the future, of the challenges and opportunities that awaited them. He knew that the trails ahead were uncertain, that the frontier was a land of constant change. But he also knew that they were ready, that they were strong, that they were united. They were partners, bound by a loyalty as unyielding as the iron that forged the frontier. They were brothers, bound by a shared sense of justice. They were survivors, bound by a shared determination to build a better future. The trails ahead were wild, dangerous, and beckoning. They would ride them together.